Welcome to the Book Hook podcast, where I've got cool insider book info, author and industry expert interviews, book reviews, and much more. I'm your host, KJ Aiello, and I can't wait to dive into today's episode with author and disability advocate Amanda Leduc.
Hi, I'm Amanda Leduc, the author of the novels Wildlife, Centaur's Wife, and the nonfiction book Disfigured on fairy tales, disability, and making space. I write a lot about grief, and I also write what someone termed weirdo literary fiction, and I am so excited to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited to have you here too. I love weirdo
Mm,
fiction. I have a whole list of questions and points that I want to talk about, but I feel like I want to start there
yeah,
now.
yeah.
What does that mean, weirdo fiction?
I
Tell
mean,
me.
I don't really know. It comes from a friend, Ardo Omer, who is also a writer and a book person in Canada. She works at the Festival of Literary Diversity, and she coined it for my latest novel, Wildlife. She interviewed me for an online launch for the book, and that's what she said. She was like, "Oh, you seem to me to be someone who's really into writing weirdo literary fiction." And I was just like, I really like that moniker. I am going to use that because it's a nice umbrella, right? I feel like it's the sort of thing that can just encompass a lot of things, and it just needs to be weird, and it goes right in there. And I am at a point in my writing life, I think, where I'm quite comfortable with that and happy to embrace that as one of my many umbrellas.
So let's talk about where this
Mm.
weirdo literary fiction came from. I do know that you are also a short story writer, but there is like a Leduc pipeline there from strange short stories to these wild, these wild novels that tackle so many different
Mm.
topics in this sort of like package of the speculative fiction that is just the oddest thing. So can we talk about how we go from the short stories to the
Yeah, yeah,
novels?
for sure. So I guess one of the first things to say is that I've always wanted to be a writer, and I went to school for writing. So I did my bachelor's degree in creative writing and philosophy at the University of Victoria. And as part of the creative writing degree, you do workshops with other people. And it was right around the time. I mean, this was the early 2000s, so realist literary fiction was quite big, and we were
Mm.
reading, we were reading Margaret Atwood, we were reading lots of other Canadian, sort of literary stalwarts. And I came away from that feeling like I needed to write a particular kind of story in order to be taken seriously.
Mm.
But I had grown up as a fantasy reader, reading Tolkien, reading C.S. Lewis, reading Octavia Butler, and I always liked stories that were strange and different, but I didn't feel like I could write those in order to be taken seriously. So I didn't
Mhm.
for most of my time in workshop. And then in my last year of workshop, I wrote a short story, which was actually inspired by a short story that I wrote when I was like 16. And it's a story about a man who's visited by an angel. And the angel looks very, not what you would expect an angel to look like. And he's kind of like drab and kind of scary, and not really the sort of uplifting idea of angels that
Mhm.
we're taught to think of when we're younger. And everybody really, really liked it. My instructor, who is Bill Gaston, he said, "Oh, I think this is my favorite of all the stories that you've written." And that story, so this would have been, I was in my mid 20s. And I took that story and it just kind of stuck with me. And I started working on it and expanding it into a novel. That story became this novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, which was my first book. And it opened up a pattern which I think has kind of followed me through the rest of my writing career to date, where I'll have an idea about something and it will usually start as a short story. And then the idea just won't go away. And the more that I sit with it, the more that I think through it, the bigger it becomes and the more themes it wants to start exploring. So, my novel, The Miracles of Ordinary Men, came out of a short story. My second novel, which is The Centaur's Wife, which came out in 2021, that also came out of a short story. And so my first novel, Miracles of Ordinary Men, came out in 2013. It was quite a while before my next book, 7 years before my next book came out. And I had the idea for my novel, The Centaur's Wife, and I was away on a writing retreat thinking about it and writing that. And as I was walking through the forest, I got this idea for another book, which was about disability and fairy tales, and it was going to be nonfiction, which I had concentrated mostly on fiction. See, we'll just leave you to put the books up because I'm just making a mess over here.
Do.
I'm knocking them over like
Yeah,
nobody's business.
I'll do it. Don't worry.
Perfect.
I'll let you.
So I had dabbled in nonfiction specifically when I went away to do my master's degree. I hadn't really focused on nonfiction before. And Disfigured, which is what my nonfiction book about fairy tales and disability ended up being called, was very much a book about fairy tales, but then also how disability in particular is portrayed in fairy tales. And it was really interesting for me to go through that book because it became a kind of manifesto. I'm disabled. I was born with cerebral palsy. I've always walked with a limp. As I've gotten older, my disability has become more pronounced in certain ways, certainly through fatigue and chronic pain, these kinds of things. And in my community work, I worked for the Festival of Literary Diversity in Canada for quite some time. And we were really trying always to make the festival as accessible as it could be. And it really opened my attention to the ways in which the literary world, much like the world around us in general, is not accessible in the ways that we could make it.
Yeah.
And all of these threads started to intertwine. So I was working through all of this sort of emotional stuff about coming to terms with my disability and recognizing that in Disfigured, there's a thread of memoir that runs through that book. And then I was also working through it politically in terms of the world that I was moving through as someone who was trying to create space and create literary space for other writers, specifically disabled writers. And I was working on my novel, The Centaur's Wife, before I began Disfigured, but I finished the nonfiction book before I finished the novel. And finishing that nonfiction book actually sort of gave me a key for what I needed The Centaur's Wife to be about. The Centaur's Wife is very much about grief and about survival. And the main character in the novel has cerebral palsy, just like me. But she didn't have cerebral palsy when I first started writing it. And I needed to write my nonfiction book about fairy tales and disability in order to really understand what the themes were that I was circling around in The Centaur's Wife. And so Disfigured came out in 2020, a couple of weeks before the world shut down for the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
And it was an interesting experience, shall we say, to suddenly have written this book that goes out into the world that is about fairy tales and disability and how the narrative that we construct around disability has very much a real world effect on how we build the world, how we interact in the world. And to suddenly see that happening in real time around me with all the things that everybody was saying about who had worthy lives in the context of this global worldwide pandemic and who didn't. That was a very interesting thing to have happened. And a year after Disfigured came out, The Centaur's Wife came out. So that was February of 2021. And again, it's a novel about survival. It's about disability. It's also very much a novel about grief. And I was working through all of these themes, which I think are very much topical in terms of they were topical in my own life. I was working through my feelings around disability, my feelings about grief, but then they're also very universal at the same time. And as I was going through all of this, I think I was recognizing that child who had always wanted to be a writer and who was always drawn to these sort of magical, fantastical themes, because I think our magical, fantastical books are really very good at drawing out a lot of these very deep themes. Fairy tales in particular are really good at grappling with what's dark and seemingly unknowable, seemingly something that you can't talk about. And they give it a shape, right? They give a shape to this kind of amorphous feeling that we all have inside of us, which is this fear of grief, this fear of change. And so all of that was sort of boiling inside of me, and it came out in these particular ways for these particular books. And Centaur's Wife came out in the spring of 2021. And then in the summer of 2021, I did the whole thing all over again. I had a short story that I wrote about, well, at that point, it would have been 7 years prior. So a short story that I wrote in the summer of 2014 or 2015, about two hyenas who live above a woman who has this random apartment. And I was really interested in the hyenas, and it just sort of came almost out of nowhere. It was influenced very much so by an English writer named Leonora Carrington, who wrote in the early 20th century. And she wrote a story called The Debutante about a woman who tries to get out of a party, and she has a hyena go to the party in her place. And I thought it was really strange and weird and beautiful. And I remember thinking, what would a story that I wrote about hyenas, what would that look like? And so I wrote this story, and suddenly it was a story about hyenas, yes, but it was also about abuse. It was about escaping one situation only to find yourself in another. And that story did the same thing. It stuck with me for years, and gradually I recognized that it was because it didn't want to be a short story anymore. It wanted to be a novel. So it became something much larger, and made itself into the novel Wildlife, which came out earlier this year. I think for me, really, if you want to boil it down to sort of its essence, I think ideas come to me and they sit with me and they work through me until they find the shape that they need to have in order to be out into the world. And in that process, I'm always in the process of becoming a writer that I need to be, the writer that I need to be in order to write that particular story. And it's been a wild and magical journey. So I guess in that sense, it just makes sense that I am writing these books that are weird and strange and hopefully wild and magical in their own ways, because I think the writing process of putting those books out into the world has very much been that as well.
I'm thinking too, as you were saying that, about going from the short stories, and a lot of these short stories were written, there's a considerable time between the short
Mm-hmm.
story that you wrote and the novels that they become, and how they've obviously changed from that as you've changed, as you've grown as a writer. Is there chronology in when these stories came to life, or is it just sort of like, they blended together and influenced each other?
Mm. Yeah, there definitely is a chronology, and it doesn't always coincide with when the story idea actually literally came into my head. I think Miracles came first, obviously, because it was sort of that first idea. But if I think about myself at 16, getting the idea for that story, and I remember writing the story and being really worried because I wrote it for a writer's craft class in my I grew up in Ontario, and it was my sort of grade 13 writer's craft. And I wrote this story, and it was weird and strange, and it didn't have a happy ending. And I remember being really worried about how it was going to be perceived by my teacher. And I wrote about it. We had these journals that we kept in class, and the teacher read them just sort of like not to be nosy, but just as kind of, overview of how we were working through our process.
Yeah.
And I remember her saying, Mrs. Dern, she passed away a couple of years ago now. But I remember her saying at the time, write the story that you want to write, because you're not going to be happy otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote this story, and I was still nervous about it, and I handed it in. And she kept me after class one day, and she was like, I just wanted to tell you that I thought your short story was wonderful. Just wonderful. Oh. And it was like, it was a real pivotal moment, because it was like the first time in my life that, and to be clear, I have a family that, loves me very much and has been very supportive my whole life of my desire to be a writer. But it really felt like it was the first time I had an outside person read my work and say, no, you've got something here. Like, you should follow this. You should really see where this goes. And it was lovely. So that came first. And then Centaur's Wife chronologically came next in terms of the idea. But it really, I think, needed to wait for Disfigured. Actually, no, that's wrong. Right. Because sorry, I'm working this out in real time.
Okay. I love this. This is happening right now.
Miracles came first, and then Wildlife as the idea, because I got the idea for that short story in 2015. That came next. Wow. And then Centaur's Wife, the idea for the short story that became Centaur's Wife, came after that. And then the idea for Disfigured came after that. But I needed to jump ahead and finish the idea that became Disfigured in order to really understand what I was talking about in writing The Centaur's Wife and what I was talking about in writing Wildlife as well. So I think there's probably this very real theme of these kind of future ideas visiting me as seeds and waiting for the right conditions in order to sprout. So, the idea for Wildlife was a seed that required 7 years or however long it was of working through these different ideas in order to get to that point of becoming a novel. The same goes for The Centaur's Wife, right? Like it was an idea that came first,
Mhm.
and then I needed to write Disfigured and work through the themes in that book in order to really understand what Centaur's Wife was going to be about.
Okay, the first thing I thought there when you're saying, the seed, you get the seed and the seed has to, sit and germinate, and it took that amount of time. First thing my head goes to is, well, how do you make a living?
Yeah,
Capitalism.
yeah.
Do you want to come back to
No, no,
that, or do we want
we can
to?
talk about it. The short answer is you don't. I haven't. I have not made a living
Yeah.
off of writing. I was working full time through that entire process. Often I was working more than full time because I was working a full time job, maybe sometimes with a part time job on the side as well. I was, doing gradually building my writing portfolio as well. So I was getting paid for little pieces that I would write here and there. I was trying to sell short stories. I was trying to sell essays, all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But the writing itself never made me money. Certainly not a
Oh,
living wage amount of money. Yeah.
capitalism and the arts. Oh, and then we also have the compounded factor of writing as a disabled writer,
Mm-hmm.
writing as a disabled writer in a capitalist
Mm-hmm.
world. How how do you navigate that?
Mm-hmm.
Is that an extra factor?
I mean, that was something that I didn't consciously think I was navigating until I was already years into the game, right? I grew up, as I said, I was born with cerebral palsy. I grew up with a limp. I was bullied quite severely in elementary school as a result of that. And the upshot of all of that was I came out of elementary school thinking, okay, to be disabled means to be made fun of, and I don't want to have that in my life. So I'm going to do everything I possibly can to prove to the world that I am not disabled, which is internalized ableism at its finest, right? But it held in my life for the better part of the next 2 decades. I just was like, I'm going to work as hard as I possibly can, and I'm going to get everything that I want in my life. And if I'm not getting everything that I want in my life, it's because I'm not working hard enough. So I'm just going to work harder.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what ended up happening, I mean, it makes sense now when I look back on it, but at the time, it just felt like that was the only option available to me, right? Just work, 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 and make sacrifices. They didn't really feel like sacrifices at the time, they felt like choices. Because I wanted to write and I also needed to survive. So it was like, well, this is the choice that I'm making. I am going to work as much as possible. And then when I'm not working, I'm going to write because that's how I emotionally survive. And it wasn't until I hit my mid 30s and was really starting to grapple with the reality of being disabled and understanding how that disability, maybe was not on the sort of visible spectrum in many ways. Like I was getting up, I was going to work, I was, doing all of the things, quote unquote, that society requires of us in order to be, again, quote unquote, functioning, productive members of society.
Yep.
But I was exhausted all the time. And, I think I probably missed out on a fair amount of certainly socializing. I mean, I have had a great life and I have lots that's really warm and really rich about it. But there were definitely instances where I remember thinking, nope, not going out today, not going out this weekend because I'm tired and I need to rest and I need to write and I need to conserve my energy for that. And I think there are ways that that kind of discussion is actually inextricable from capitalism because the reality is that I needed to work in order to survive, in order to pay my rent, in order to pay my bills. And so I didn't, as much as I say, I made these choices, I made these sacrifices, whatever. In some ways, they weren't even choices that I was consciously making, right? They were just things that I had to do in order to keep doing what I wanted to do. I don't know if this is answering the question in the way that you want, but I think it actually illustrates a problem that many disabled people have, most if not all, under capitalism, which is survival becomes the thing that we're all focused on. And in order for me to survive, I needed to be able to write. I needed to be able to get these stories out of my head, right? They're swirling around in my brain and they need to go down on the page. And it would be great if I could get published. That was what I was shooting for. But I also just needed to have them come out. And I can remember doing things like I worked at a hospital for a number of years doing data entry. And on slow moments, like I would bring a notebook and I would just write stories. And it's so funny to me now because it's like you're working at your job and then you're also working at your other job, your sort of chosen job. while you're working. And
Yeah.
it just, all these layers compound, right? Work upon work upon work upon work, because that is what the world requires of you, in order to survive and in order to have any kind of modicum of happiness, in order that you aren't like
Yeah.
surviving and feeling terrible at the same time. Like
Yeah.
it just layer upon layer upon layer of work. So, but I think that, has been my experience of being a disabled writer in the world. It has just been the absolute huge amount of work that it has required. And then getting to a point suddenly where I recognized, okay, I can't keep doing this. Like I can't keep working full time on another job and then freelancing and then trying to work on my other projects, which hopefully one day in the future will make me money. Like something needs to give. I need to make choices and maybe some real sacrifices in this instance, in order to have a life where I can rest and write and make all of that possible. And the other element of that is privilege, of course, because there are a lot of disabled people who don't get to make that choice, right? Like,
I remember it was a few months ago, you held a workshop, I think it was with The Fold, and it was about, how to navigate being a disabled writer.
mm-hmm.
And one of the themes that you brought up, which really resonated with me as somebody who's working through my own internalized ableism, was grief. And
Mm-hmm.
you write a lot about grief. And I also noticed that you sort of, I guess it's two sides of the same coin. You write also about anger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if we can dive into a little bit of that in your work and where that comes from and how you write through that. It's a
Yeah,
huge question, I know.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, it's so interesting, the sort of circuitous paths that get us to where we end up as writers, right?
Right.
Because I think really the first time I was kind of cognizant of writing about grief was when I wrote The Centaur's Wife. And even then, I was not cognizant for, I would say, probably 90% of writing that book. I didn't think that was what I was writing about. I thought I was actually writing a book about desire and
Yeah.
forbidden desire, which obviously makes a lot of sense. Like that also feeds into grief too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because grief is always about, in some way, shape, or form, not having something that you would like to have or experience. That's a very reductive way of looking at it, but on its basic level, right? And I had written this novel about forbidden desire, and then it became a novel about disability, and in that process very much became a novel about grief. And I didn't recognize it until my editor read what ended up becoming sort of the like almost final version of the book. And she was like, it's really interesting because you have written a novel about grief here. And at that point in time, this was the end of 2019, and my best friend passed away at the end of the year from breast cancer. And hearing my editor say that was this sudden realization, like I had been writing towards this grief that I didn't actually even know was coming in my own life. But it was like I was preparing something, preparing myself, preparing my work in some way, shape, or form. And even in that act of preparing, I was also calling back to so many of the stories that I had written before, which were grappling with what it meant to live in a different body, which of course is very much about living with grief, right? Because you are making this movement through having expectation and also recognizing the world that, has not given you these expectations, or, given you something that you did not expect. And navigating all of that is definitely grief. And so that was very interesting to hear my editor say that about the book. And it's a book on its sort of surface about this. It's a post-apocalyptic novel, and it's about, survival. And what is survival if not grappling with grief all the time, right? Like trying to move past trauma in your past towards a new kind of future. And so that was it's always fascinating to me as a writer, because you think you're writing one thing when you sit down to write a story, and you usually end up writing something else. You can still be writing the thing that you were hoping to write at the beginning, but it always takes on a life of its own. And often that life of its own has different things to show you. And in that same vein, when I look back now, I can sort of see like this lens of grief, this lens of disability. It floods all of my earlier work in this new kind of light, which is very, very interesting to me, because I think I think I have always been feeling my way towards this inevitable future.
As, a middle-aged
Mm,
disabled writer myself, there is a lot of grief that I am grappling with in my own writing practice. First of all, time.
mhm,
Like I am coming to the same realization that you illustrated for me in that workshop, and I don't even know if you realize how impactful that was on me. I mean, Disfigured was one of the most impactful books in my life. I would have not
oh,
written my book without this book. And I feel like there is this grief in the realization
mm,
that, my brain does not work the same. My brain requires more breaks, more forgiveness
mhm,
than I would say probably, for non-disabled people. And there is something to that in living in, our world,
mhm.
particularly our capitalist world, our economy that's kind of run rampant now. It is very difficult to move through that. And I do feel like your work really helps in that. And I had no question there. I just also wanted to gush a little bit in how important your work has been to me,
Mm.
as well as you. I mean, obviously, you're you. But I
Thank
wanted to.
you.
No, you're most welcome. I feel like I saw a meme the other day and it was, tell your friends something nice.
Mm.
It doesn't matter what it is, just tell them something nice because they need to hear it and we don't say nice things enough. So that is my nice thing for today, and you are most definitely deserving of the nice
Thank
thing.
you.
I'm wondering if we could switch a little bit. This
Mm.
is a really elegant segue to the form of wildlife. And I have
Mhm.
asked you this question a million times, but I just want to keep going back to this, is that the form of wildlife that you chose to write in this novel, it is like a collection of short stories with
Mhm.
these common themes, but it does serve with a fully formed narrative arc. However, yeah, you know what's going with this. However, the, what you've done with it, in the very middle, you've got this thesis paper written by, I guess the protagonist of that sort of,
Mhm.
story. And there's a conversation happening there between the editor, the professor, and the student. And then you've got transcripts. I mean, where did this come from and why did you choose this sort of different form? This.
Mhm. Well, I've always been interested in form. I
Mhm.
think as a short story writer, initially as a short story writer, even though I didn't think of myself, and it feels ironic to say this, right? After I've
Mhm.
talked on this very podcast just a few minutes ago about how everything starts as a short story and
Mhm.
then moves to a novel, right? I always sort of thought of myself as a novelist, partly because I think we were sort of taught that was the goal. Like short stories are fine and well and good, but you really want to write a novel because the novel is the thing that
Mhm.
will maybe make you money. So I hadn't thought of myself as a short story writer, but I do think that there is an opportunity in the short story form because it is shorter. There's an
Mhm.
opportunity to be a little bit more experimental. And there's a way for that experiment to be a little more palatable, I think,
Mhm.
sometimes to audiences because it is sort of shorter. You can wrap your head around it.
Mhm.
And I was also, so that's something that I've always been interested in. I've been interested in form, I've been interested in how short stories can kind of traverse that space, right? That experimental
Mhm.
space. I've also always been interested in the way that novels, there's a very clearly defined beginning and ending, and the novel sort of exists between these two spaces, right?
Mhm.
And I wanted to explore what it's like for a novel to feel like it exists beyond the bounds of
Mhm.
its beginning and ending. And when I was writing Wildlife, I was just so fascinated by the fact that I had these characters, these hyenas who walked and talked like human beings, and then this woman who was escaping this abusive relationship. But I knew there was so much to their story that existed outside of the bounds of that particular short story. And I
Mhm.
was trying to find a way to make it immersive and huge
Mhm.
while also staying contained. So,
Mhm.
what ended up happening for anyone who hasn't read the book is Wildlife is this novel about this cult that essentially rises up in the wake of these two hyenas who walk and talk. And it's about how the hyenas interact with various different people over the course of every single chapter. And each chapter is written from the perspective of the person who interacts with the hyenas in some way. So we never actually hear from the hyenas themselves. They're only
Mhm.
ever, someone who's observed. And that gave me a lot of freedom to have a different narrator in each particular chapter, and then also
Mhm.
to explore and experiment with what a particular form might feel like for that
Mhm.
particular chapter. And it kind of came organically from there. Like I didn't start out each chapter thinking, I'm going to try something innovative and structurally different. Each chapter started from, okay, now we're writing from the perspective of this particular person, and this is the setting in which they find themselves. And how does that come about? And
Yeah.
it sort of came organically from there. By the time I got to the academic paper chapter, which you referenced, I was sort of halfway through the book, and I knew that we needed something to really anchor the feeling of the novel, anchor this sort of mythology and world that I had built in the novel itself. I was just sort of like, well, let's try an academic paper, because it's a novel about a particular religion, and people write academic papers about religion all the time, right? But
Yeah.
as I was writing the academic paper, then I was like, oh, I can't just have this one voice, though. I
Mhm.
need to have a sort of interplay. And that's when the idea came in for having someone who was writing the chapter, but then also someone who was reading the chapter at the same time and making kind of
Mhm.
editorial comments on it. And I remember talking to my agent about that and being like,
Yeah.
I have this chapter that is an academic paper, and we're going to have comments on it as well. And my agent was like,
Oh,
uh-huh.
what?
Uh, I've never seen that done before. And I was like, well, we'll see. I mean, I think it's also key to point out here that one of my favorite books is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer
Mhm.
Egan, right?
Mhm.
And she does very similar things where each particular chapter is kind of a short story, but it speaks to this larger world that these characters all inhabit. And one of
Mhm.
the short stories is written in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. And what I loved about her work, and what I hope I've been able to accomplish in mine, is this sense of a much larger world of the novel. And the novel actually inhabits this universe that began long before the novel itself begins on the first page and continues long after the novel ends. So with each particular short story, you're kind of like dipping in and getting a taste,
Yep.
and then dipping right out, but then dipping back in and having all of these callbacks to previous short stories, previous chapters that together all succeed in building this larger world. And it was so much fun and, difficult in many ways. I mean, the academic
Mhm.
paper, for as much as everybody talks about it, like it was hard. It was hard to
Yeah.
write. I just remember sitting in front of my computer for hours and being like, this doesn't work. I don't know what's going
Mhm.
on. I actually had someone who was a religious studies scholar like read part of it, and I just kept thinking, oh, you poor man. Like you're reading this fake academic paper about a
Yeah.
fake religion about hyenas who like talk like human beings. Just, you are a true gem of a human being, and I'm so
Yeah.
thankful. But at the same time, approaching the novel that way, in some weird ways, it actually felt easier. And I'm probably jinxing myself when I say that, because each particular chapter was its own world, and it could be its own little contained thing that I
Mhm.
could dip into and really immerse myself in, and then come out of. And okay, the next chapter. And all I need to worry about right now with this next chapter is being true to this particular world and this particular conceit of this story. And then I can figure out the connective tissue on a wider level when the whole thing is done. Uh, and it was just, it's the most fun I've ever had in writing a novel.
It's
And I hope
phenomenal.
I hope that I get that experience again, because it was really wonderful. It really was.
I think this is a point where it's like, this is why you always need to have disabled people at the table, because we have learned to be creative,
It's
like
true.
think outside the box.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely, and this is why I keep asking you the same question. I also get a little bit more every time I ask you. I'm like, oh, I'm really digging in here. Um, I'm wondering too, though, because you do write about these themes that, I mean, first of all, writing about disability itself, or writing about, there is some climate grief in the Centaur's wife that I picked up anyways.
Mm.
Um, you can't exactly wrap this up with a tidy bow. How do you come to the conclusion of your work? And this is also in Disfigured as well.
I mean, I think that's maybe part of what I was saying before when I was always looking at narrative
Mhm.
as something that exists beyond the bounds of beginning and ending, right? Because narrative continues all the time. Like even our stories as human beings, they have ostensibly a birth and a death, but who you are as a human being actually exists far outside of that. The impact that you have on others continues long after you are gone. And
Mhm.
even, the moments leading up to your birth and the sort of all the factors that come together to make you possible,
Mhm.
all of that contributes to something that really does exist outside of these kind of arbitrary, if you will,
Mhm.
arbitrary beginnings and endings. And I think as a disabled person, I am always interested in seeing how the narrative continues because I think from a disability perspective, we are often taught that something fundamental ends once disability enters the picture. And actually, I would argue that the truth is that something fundamental begins as soon as
Mhm.
disability enters the picture, right? We talk about it in science and technology as disability being a real key driver of
Yeah.
innovation. And I would like, my work to contribute to that conversation in that sort of way. If I can encourage people to think beyond the kind of arbitrary nature of beginnings and endings and think about how things continue just in different forms, whether it's a novel that, I hope the world stays with someone above and beyond
Mhm.
beginning and ending their read, to the way that a writer's body of work exists long after they are gone, to what are all the factors that make someone the writer that they are today, just like you and I
Yeah.
have been talking about, right? If there's a way to shift perception so that that is what people are encouraged to focus on, and to always think about the new things that could come, that really has become one of the key focuses of the work that I'm putting out into the world.
And speaking of beginnings and endings, I can't help but think of, your your foray into astrophysics.
Oh yeah.
Can we talk
Yeah.
about what's coming next and thinking outside the box, speaking of
Hmm.
which?
Yeah. So my next novel, no, it's not even a novel. My next book
Mhm.
is a memoir, and it's about my friend who died at the end of 2019. It's about our friendship, but it's really about the process of grieving. And for whatever reason, in the sort of immediate years after she died, I got really interested in astronomy and astrophysics and just
Mhm.
thinking about outer space. Not necessarily on the level of the science, because I am not a trained scientist at all. And it's like very hard in many ways to wrap my brain around so much of the knowledge that is required to
Mhm.
really understand this kind of stuff. But I was interested in the sort of the way that grief and the immensity of outer space made like a very clear connection for me. The grief, certainly in the first few early months of it, early years really, it just felt so enormous, and it felt like there was nothing that compared to it until I started thinking about space and
Mhm.
outer space and the sort of infinite nature
Yeah.
of outer space. And so that is kind of where my mind went, and it's where my mind has been for the better part of the last couple of years.
Mhm.
And that book will hopefully, if all goes well, be coming out in the spring of 2027. So we're in the
Congratulations.
editing stages right now, which is, a whole other thing.
So what has that been like to write, first of all, going back to, the grief of the loss of your friend who I know you
Mm,
were extremely close with, and I'm very sorry for that loss, for your loss.
thank you.
Um, but also pairing this with the immense research that
Mm.
you've been undertaking in order to be able to weave these two narratives together. What has that been like?
I guess you could say it's kind of been like how I was describing my process for writing Wildlife, where
Hmm.
in Wildlife, what I ended up doing actually was writing a novel that does end up being quite ambitious, but I took it one chunk at a time.
Hmm.
And writing this memoir about astrophysics and also about grief felt very much the same, where it's not like I'm not writing an entire history of space. I'm writing about the elements of space that interest me and feel like a metaphor for grief. So each
Mhm.
particular chapter of this book does a dive. I won't even say a deep dive because I'm not qualified to do that sort of thing, but a dive into a particular element of space
Mhm.
as intertwined with a particular moment in my grief. And I guess it's like that saying, which it's a terrible saying on some levels, but how do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant one bite at a time, kind of thing.
Poor
And
elephant.
I know the poor elephant, um, but that's the idea, right? Like
Mhm.
anything you can say, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step.
So,
It's that
yep.
same sort of idea, right? Like just bit by bit, it all adds up to something else.
It's amazing. I cannot wait for this. Do we have a title that we can
We
actually?
do.
What's the
Uh,
title?
it's called The Possible Universe, a memoir of
Mm,
friendship across space and time.
I cannot wait. All right, everybody, you need to mark that down. Either spring or fall next year.
Spring of 2027, actually. So
Spring.
not next year,
Okay.
but the year after.
Okay. Well, you're coming back when
Hmm.
this book comes out,
I would love
and
to.
yeah, I'm gonna have a million questions, and it's probably gonna be in my favorite 2027 reads. This is my prediction. Okay.
No pressure. No
No
pressure at
pressure.
all.
Do it right. Well, thank you so much. Amanda Leduc, one of my favorite people of all time, who has inspired me, showed me the way, brought me into the fold. Ha ha ha, that you're working with the fold again, which congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
I cannot wait to read what you've got coming out next. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me, KJ. It's been a real pleasure, as always.